The galaxy thought humanity was a cosmic joke, a fragile, hairless species barely clinging to a frozen death world. To the elite alien diplomats aboard the luxury star cruiser, the lone human they salvaged was nothing more than an exotic, trembling pet. Then the hull breached, the pirate armada poured in, and the pet stopped playing nice. The interstellar luxury freighter, the Sovereign Veil, was a marvel of modern galactic engineering, a gleaming dart of polished iridium and chronal glass cruising silently through the velvet expanse of the Orion Spur. Owned by the deeply influential Veltra Consortium, the vessel was currently chartered to transport a delegation of high-born aristocrats, corporate executives, and a highly classified shipment of refined quantum palladium bound for the Boeing Dassault orbital shipyards in the core worlds. It was a vessel of extreme opulence, featuring cascading indoor waterfalls, zero-gravity meditation chambers, and atmospheric scrubbers that hummed with a soft, melodic frequency. Commanding this floating palace was High Captain Xenthos, a Veltra of impeccable lineage. Like all of his species, Xenthos was a towering figure of elegance, standing nearly 7 feet tall, with a slender, bioluminescent exoskeleton that shimmered with hues of azure and amethyst, depending on his mood. The Veltra were a highly evolved, deeply intellectual species. They had outgrown the barbaric need for physical violence eons ago, relying instead on diplomacy, corporate maneuvering, and automated defense drones to maintain their dominance. And they possessed an insatiable appetite for the rare and the exotic, which was exactly why Arthur Campbell was currently sitting on a plush, velvet-lined habitation cushion in the corner of the captain's private ready room, eating a synthesized nutrient wafer. Arthur was, by all galactic definitions, an anomaly. The Veltra exploration frigate Ethelgard had found him adrift in a derelict primitive escape pod on the outer fringes of the dead sectors 6 standard months ago. The pod's transponder had broadcast a repeating, archaic signal, its hull stamped with the faded, ancient insignia of the SpaceX Lockheed Vanguard, a corporate entity completely unknown to the wider galactic archives. When the Veltra breached the pod, they found Arthur in deep cryostasis. Upon thawing him, they were met with a creature that completely baffled their top xenobiologists. Arthur was incredibly short by galactic standards, standing a mere 5 feet 10 inches. He possessed absolutely no natural armor, no scales, no exoskeleton, no chitinous plating. His skin was soft, pliable, and easily bruised. He lacked claws, venom sacs, or mandibles. His auditory and olfactory senses were pitifully dull compared to the apex predators of the cosmos. Furthermore, he required a dangerously high concentration of oxygen to survive, and the gravity of standard galactic vessels had to be slightly adjusted so he wouldn't supposedly crush his own fragile internal organs. To Captain Xenthos and the rest of the crew, Arthur was a delightful, harmless biological curiosity. He was a pet. "Look at him, First Officer Crix," Xenthos murmured, his mandibles clicking in a tone of deep affection. He tapped the chronal glass table, watching Arthur. "He sits so quietly." The xenobiologists were certain his species was incapable of higher-tier cognitive reasoning, given their lack of neurocranial ridges. Yet, he has learned to operate the nutrient dispenser all by himself. Crix, slightly shorter than the captain, and glowing a soft, skeptical orange, crossed her 4 elongated arms. "He is an interesting specimen, Captain, though I admit I find his lack of natural defenses disturbing. If he were to trip on the promenade decking, his fragile endoskeleton might fracture. I have assigned a low-level hovering medical droid to follow him at a discreet distance." "A wise precaution," Xenthos agreed, taking a sip of his ionized nectar. "The board of directors at the Veltra Consortium will pay a handsome sum for him when we reach the core worlds. An exotic creature from an uncharted death world, docile enough to keep in a high-rise orbital suite? The socialites will start a bidding war." In the corner of the room, Arthur Campbell chewed his nutrient wafer, his face an unreadable mask of blank indifference. Arthur understood every word they were saying. His internal subdermal translator, courtesy of a highly classified wetwork program back in the Sol system, was decrypting the Veltra language perfectly. Before he had been left adrift in a sabotaged escape pod, Arthur had been a Tier 1 operative for Academie Stellari, a private military corporation that handled the dirty, bloody jobs the United Earth government preferred to keep off the official ledgers. For 15 years, Arthur had fought in the mud, the blood, and the toxic atmospheres of contested mining colonies. He had cleared out pirate dens in the asteroid belts of Alpha Centauri and survived orbital drops that turned normal men into liquefied paste. When he was rescued by the Veltra, he had quickly assessed his situation. He was unarmed, surrounded by highly advanced extraterrestrials, and light years from human-controlled space. When they began treating him like a fragile, dim-witted companion animal, Arthur made a tactical decision. He leaned into it. It was, frankly, the best vacation he had ever had. He didn't have to dodge plasma fire. He didn't have to sleep in cryotubes that smelled of ozone and recycled sweat. The aliens gave him incredibly soft clothes, fed him whenever he pressed a button, and the gravity on this ship was only about 0.4 Gs compared to Earth. To Arthur, walking around the Sovereign Veil felt like floating on a cloud. So he played the part. He acted confused by basic holographic technology. He pretended to struggle with heavy doors. Whenever Captain Zenthos patted his head with a smooth, three-fingered hand, Arthur simply blinked his brown eyes and offered a blank, docile stare. "Do you think he understands us?" Crix asked, leaning closer to Arthur. She waved a hand in front of his face. Arthur let his jaw go slightly slack and blinked slowly, exactly like a confused golden retriever. "Doubtful." Zenthos chuckled, his exoskeleton shimmering a warm, amused pink. "His brain pan is far too small, but he is remarkably well behaved. Come, Crix, we must attend to the navigation logs. We are preparing to transition through the Kalen Drift." As the two towering aliens glided out of the ready room, the heavy blast doors hissing shut behind them, Arthur's demeanor instantly shifted. The slack, empty expression vanished, replaced by the hardened, cold calculus of a veteran operator. He stood up, his posture correcting from a submissive slouch to a rigid, coiled stance. He walked over to the viewport, looking out at the swirling hyperspace tunnel of blue and violet light. His eyes narrowed. The Kalen Drift was a notoriously unstable region of space. Back in the Sol system, naval intelligence always advised avoiding standard shipping lanes through asteroid-heavy drifts. It was a tactical choke point. It was where you got ambushed. Arthur stretched his neck, a loud, sharp crack echoing in the quiet room. He had been playing the pet for 6 months. He sincerely hoped he wouldn't have to go back to work. The ambush was executed with a brutal, terrifying precision that only seasoned predators possessed. Arthur was asleep in his luxurious velvet-lined terrarium when the ship's artificial gravity violently shuddered. He was instantly awake, his military instincts overriding the deep slumber before his eyes even opened. He didn't sit up in panic. He rolled smoothly off the plush bed and pressed his back flat against the cold bulkhead, making himself a minimal target. A deafening, grinding shriek tore through the ship's superstructure. The soft, melodic hum of the environmental scrubbers was instantly replaced by the blaring, chaotic wail of the ship's general quarters alarm. The pristine, soothing white lighting of the corridors flashed to a harsh, strobing crimson. On the bridge, Captain Zenthos gripped the primary console, his bioluminescence flashing a panicked, stark white. "Report! Did we strike a spatial anomaly?" "Captain!" Crix shouted from the sensor station, her voice trembling. "We have been forcibly ripped from slip space. Someone has deployed a localized gravity snare. Our Lockheed Martin star drive is offline. The primary coils are flooded with feedback." "A gravity snare?" Zenthos gasped. "That is highly illegal military hardware. Who could possibly—" "Multiple contacts," Crix interrupted, her digits flying across the holographic interface. They were waiting in the shadows of the drift asteroids. "Captain, the transponder codes. It's the Blood Blight Armada, the Skarn." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the bridge, broken only by the wail of the alarms. The Skarn. They were the apex predators of the Outer Rim, a nomadic species of hulking, warmongering brutes who augmented their massive frames with crude, heavy cybernetics. They didn't negotiate. They didn't take hostages for political leverage. They boarded, they slaughtered, and they took what they wanted. "Evasive maneuvers," Zenthos ordered, panic finally breaking through his aristocratic composure. "Bring the automated defense turrets online. Divert all auxiliary power to the deflector shields." "The turrets are not responding," the the tactical officer cried out. The Skarn deployed a localized EMP burst upon our exit from slipspace. Our external targeting sensors are completely blind. They are closing the distance. Captain. They are launching boarding pods. Deep in the bowels of the ship, Arthur felt the distinct, unmistakable thud of heavy magnetic grapples slamming into the hull. The vibrations traveled through the metal decking, traveling right up through Arthur's bare feet. He closed his eyes, analyzing the kinetic feedback. 1 thud, 2 thuds, 4, 6. 6 boarding pods. Assuming standard tactical deployment for heavy infantry, that was roughly 40 to 50 hostiles breaching the hull. The door to Arthur's quarters hissed open, and Captain Zenthos rushed in, flanked by 2 heavily armored Veltra security guards holding elegant but ultimately flimsy ceremonial plasma pikes. Zenthos looked terrified. His exoskeleton was entirely pale, drained of all color. "Arthur! Come here, little one!" Zenthos gestured frantically, treating Arthur exactly like a frightened child. The captain grabbed a heavy, insulated containment blanket from the wall and moved toward him. "It is all right. Do not be frightened by the loud noises. We are moving you to the VIP panic vault in the central core. You must stay quiet." Arthur allowed himself to be wrapped in the blanket. He let his hands tremble slightly, widening his eyes to mimic terror. As Zenthos guided him out into the corridor, Arthur's mind was working at 1,000,000 miles an hour. He was cataloging the layout of the ship, the locations of the armories, the choke points in the corridors. The ship was in absolute chaos. Veltra, aristocrats, and corporate executives were running through the halls, their beautiful robes trailing behind them, their voices raised in a cacophony of panicked chirps and clicks. They were an unarmed, pacifistic species trapped in a tin can with bloodthirsty reavers. It was going to be a slaughter. "Move! Move to the central vault!" Crix was shouting, herding the wealthy passengers toward a massive, reinforced titanium door at the end of the promenade. Zenthos pushed Arthur into the vault, an expansive, heavily shielded room designed to withstand orbital bombardment. Around 50 Veltra were huddled inside, clutching each other in sheer terror. The 2 security guards stood at the entrance, their hands visibly shaking as they held their weapons. "Seal the door," Zenthos ordered. As the massive blast doors began to slowly grind shut, Arthur slipped out from under his blanket and stood near the back of the vault, observing the monitors that displayed the ship's internal security feeds. The Veltra were too panicked to notice their pet operating the complex holographic interface. On the screen, Arthur watched the breach. In the main cargo bay, the exterior hull suddenly bubbled, glowing a furious, blinding white before exploding inward. A localized breaching charge. Through the smoke and twisting metal strode the Skarn. They were monstrous. Standing over 8 feet tall, they possessed broad, heavily muscled torsos, covered in thick, leathery gray skin. Many of them had mechanical limbs grafted onto their bodies, hydraulic arms ending in monomolecular blades, optic sensors bolted directly into their skulls. They carried massive, rotary plasma cannons that looked heavy enough to snap a normal man's spine. The Veltra's automated security drones deployed from the ceiling, small hovering spheres armed with pacification lasers. The Skarn didn't even take cover. They simply marched forward, their thick hides absorbing the weak laser fire as they raised their heavy weapons and blasted the drones out of the air in a shower of sparks. They moved with brutal, terrifying efficiency. They were hunting. "By the ancestors," Zenthos whispered, staring at the monitor feed that was being broadcast into the vault. "They are slaughtering the engineering crew. We are defenseless." Arthur watched the screen. The Skarn were advancing up the main arterial corridor, heading straight for the VIP deck. They knew exactly where the high-value targets were hiding. Arthur looked down at his own hands. He had enjoyed the soft beds. He had enjoyed the nutrient wafers. He had really, really enjoyed not having to kill anyone for 6 months. He sighed, a soft, distinctly human sound that was entirely lost in the panicked wailing of the alien aristocrats. The heavy titanium blast doors of the VIP vault reverberated with a deafening boom. Inside, the Veltra executives shrieked, cowering further back into the luxurious panic room. The 2 security guards standing by the door raised their plasma pikes, but the weapons were wavering wildly in their grip. Boom. The thick metal began to bow inward. The center of the door glowed cherry red. the temperature in the vault spiking dramatically as the Skarn applied a thermal breaching lance to the exterior. "They are cutting through," Crix yelled, throwing her arms over her head. "Captain, what do we do?" "Stand firm!" Zenthos shouted to the guards, though his voice cracked with utter despair. He turned and looked frantically for Arthur. "Where is the pet? Keep him under the biobed!" "He will die of cardiac arrest from the stress." Arthur was not under the biobed. He was standing directly to the right of the blast door, pressed flat against the wall, perfectly positioned in the blind spot of the breach. He had stripped off the ridiculous, silky robes the Veltra had dressed him in, standing in his form-fitting black undersuit. His muscles were loose, his breathing controlled, his heart rate a steady, rhythmic 60 beats per minute. Earth was a death world. Its gravity was nearly 3 times denser than the galactic standard. Its atmosphere was volatile, its flora and fauna highly aggressive. Humans had not evolved with natural armor or razor-sharp claws. They had evolved to out-endure, out-think, and out-kill every single thing that stood in their way. In this low-gravity environment, Arthur felt like a coiled spring of kinetic energy. Screesh! The thermal lance cut a perfect circle in the center of the blast door. With a final explosive kick, a massive slab of titanium was blown inward, crashing onto the deck. Smoke and ash poured into the vault. Through the haze stepped Malachor, a warlord of the Blood-Blight Armada. He was a towering behemoth of scarred muscle and crude cybernetics. One of his eyes was a glowing red optic implant, and his right arm ended in a massive hydraulic pincer. He carried a heavy particle repeater slung over his shoulder. Behind him, 4 more Skarn pirates pushed into the room, their weapons raised, emitting deep, guttural laughs at the sight of the cowering aristocrats. Well, Malachor rumbled, his voice like grinding tectonic plates. His translator collar broadcasted his words in the universal standard. "Look at the shiny little bugs hiding in their box. Strip them of their jewelry. Execute the guards. We take the rest as slaves for the mining pit." The 2 Veltra guards lunged forward in a desperate, foolish charge. Malachor didn't even flinch. He casually swung his hydraulic pincer, backhanding the first guard. The impact launched the tall, elegant alien across the room, his exoskeleton shattering against the bulkhead with a sickening crunch. The second pirate raised his particle repeater and vaporized the other guard with a single deafening shot. Zenthos fell to his knees, utterly defeated. "Take what you want," he begged, his bioluminescence entirely dark. "Just leave us our lives." Malachor sneered, stepping further into the room. "I do not negotiate with bugs." He raised his weapon, aiming it squarely at the captain's chest. From the blind spot beside the door, Arthur moved. To the Veltra, and even to the cybernetically enhanced Skarn, it didn't look like Arthur took a step. It looked like he simply teleported. Unburdened by Earth's crushing gravity, Arthur moved with a terrifying, explosive speed that broke the laws of galactic biology. In a fraction of a second, he closed the 10-foot gap between the wall and the closest pirate. Before the pirate could even register the blur of motion in his peripheral vision, Arthur struck. He didn't use a weapon. He used the dense, calcium-rich bone structure of a high-gravity biped. He drove the heel of his palm upward, bypassing the pirate's thick dermal plating, and struck directly beneath the creature's jawline. The kinetic force generated by Arthur's strike was astronomical. The pirate's head snapped back with a horrific crack, its heavy cervical spine cleanly severing under the immense pressure. The 8-foot behemoth dropped to the deck like a puppet, with its strings cut, dead before it even hit the floor. The room froze. The shrieking of the Veltra stopped. The cruel laughter of the Skarn vanished. Every eye in the room stared in stunned, absolute disbelief at the tiny, hairless creature standing over a dead 800-pound marauder. Malachor's optic sensor whirred, attempting to focus on Arthur. What is that?" Arthur didn't wait for them to recover from their shock. As the dead pirate fell, Arthur's hands moved in a blur. He unslung the heavy particle repeater from the falling corpse's shoulder. To a Veltra, the weapon was immovable. To a Skarn, it was heavy artillery. To Arthur, who had spent his life rucking 90 pounds of gear through the Hindu Kush, it felt like an oversized toy. He spun on his heel, dropping to one knee to minimize his profile, and leveled the weapon. Thwack, thwack, thwack. He fired 3 controlled bursts. He didn't aim for center mass, he knew their hides were thick. He aimed for the unarmored joints and the visual receptors. The second pirate took a burst directly through his primary eye cluster, his skull detonating outward. The third pirate raised his weapon, but Arthur was already moving, rolling across the deck with blistering speed. He came up into a crouch and fired again, blowing out the third pirate's kneecap. As the massive creature roared and collapsed forward, Arthur stepped in, driving the heavy steel stock of the rifle directly into the pirate's temple, crushing its skull. 3 dead, in less than 4 seconds. "Kill it!" Malachor roared, pure panic lacing his guttural voice. He swung his particle repeater toward Arthur, holding down the trigger. Searing bolts of superheated plasma tore through the air, melting the pristine walls of the vault. But Arthur wasn't there. His situational awareness, honed by decades of urban pacification, kept him 2 steps ahead. He vaulted off the edge of a crushed biobed, propelling himself into the air. He soared over the plasma fire, his trajectory perfectly calculated. As he descended, he dropped the empty rifle and landed squarely on the shoulders of the 4th pirate. The Skarn thrashed, trying to grab the human on his back. Arthur simply locked his legs around the creature's thick neck, reached down, and drew the pirate's own jagged combat knife from its chest sheath. With a ruthless, practiced efficiency, Arthur drove the blade deep into the soft tissue at the base of the alien's skull, severing the brainstem. Arthur rode the collapsing body to the floor, vaulting off it and landing in a perfect, balanced crouch, the bloody combat knife held tightly in his grip. Only Malachor remained. The pirate warlord stood frozen, his hydraulic arm twitching. He looked at the bodies of his elite boarding party, slaughtered in less than 10 seconds by a creature barely half his size. He looked at Arthur, at the cold, dead, apex predator stare in the human's brown eyes. In the corner of the room, Captain Zenthos stared at Arthur, his mind completely broken by what he was witnessing. The fragile curio, the trembling pet. Arthur slowly stood up to his full height. He rolled his shoulders, flicking the alien blood off the combat knife. He reached up to his neck, pressing a finger against the invisible subdermal comms link buried under his skin, accessing the ship's internal PA system that he had hacked weeks ago out of sheer boredom. "Campbell to actual," Arthur muttered, his voice echoing through the ship's speakers in a deep, chilling baritone that completely lacked his usual submissive whine. "Vacation's over. Commencing hostile pacification." He looked up at Malachor, offering the terrified warlord a cold, predatory smile. "Who's next?" The sheer audacity of the situation left the bridge crew of the Sovereign Vale paralyzed. High Captain Zenthos and First Officer Crix watched the internal security feeds in absolute, unblinking horror. The creature they had treated like a delicate, dim-witted lapdog was currently stalking the blood-soaked corridors of their luxury vessel, systematically dismantling a highly militarized Skarn boarding party with the ruthless efficiency of a machine. Malachor, the towering Skarn warlord, did not stay to fight. For the first time in his long, brutal career of piracy across the Outer Rim, he experienced the cold, paralyzing grip of terror. He fired wildly, superheated plasma, scorching the pristine chronoglass bulkheads, and then he turned and fled. His heavy, cybernetically enhanced footfalls pounded against the deck as he desperately rushed back toward the primary cargo bay where the boarding pods were docked. Arthur Campbell did not immediately give chase. He knelt beside the fallen pirates, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He scavenged 2 heavy thermal detonators from a dead Skarn's belt, a high-capacity plasma pistol, and a tactical comms relay. He synced the alien tech with his subdermal Academi Stellari combat interface, an illegal piece of cyberware manufactured by a shadow subsidiary of Palantir Technologies back on Earth. Instantly, his vision was overlaid with a pale green tactical HUD. The Palantir software went to work, translating the alien ship's schematics, calculating thermal blooms, and mapping the trajectory of every hostile presence on board. Arthur tapped his comms link again. "Captain Zenthos, I need you to override the lockdown protocols on decks 4 through 7. Drop the environmental lighting to 5% and disengage the atmospheric scrubbers in the cargo bay." In the VIP vault, Zenthos stared at the audio receiver, his mandibles quivering. "Arthur, what? What are you?" "I am the man who is going to keep you alive, Captain," Arthur replied, his voice a steady, cold monotone. "But you need to follow my orders exactly. Drop the lighting. Now." Xanthos, stripped of his aristocratic pride and entirely dependent on this terrifying apex predator, nodded frantically. "Do it, Crix! Execute the command!" The ship plunged into near-total darkness. The emergency crimson strobes ceased, leaving only the faint, eerie glow of emergency floor strips. For the Skarn, whose optic sensors were calibrated for the bright, harsh lighting of deep space combat, the sudden darkness was blinding. For Arthur, whose species had evolved hunting in the pitch-black canopies of primordial Earth, it was a familiar friend. Furthermore, his Palantir HUD highlighted the massive, heat-radiating bodies of the pirates in bright, blooming, thermal silhouettes. He moved through the ventilation shafts, completely bypassing the main corridors. The gravity difference was his greatest weapon. The alien xenobiologists had entirely failed to account for the fundamental physics of Earth's dense gravity well. The kinetic energy of Arthur's strikes and movements was governed by the classic equation. With his mass unburdened by the 0.4g environment of the Veltra ship, his velocity increased exponentially, turning his bone structure into a biological railgun. He didn't just walk. He propelled himself with a terrifying, silent grace. In Sector 4, a squad of 6 Skarn marauders was attempting to breach the secondary engineering bay, hoping to disable the ship's remaining deflector shields. They were shouting guttural commands, confused by the sudden darkness and the loss of contact with their warlord. Arthur dropped from the ceiling access panel directly behind their rearguard. He didn't use a firearm. Firearms made noise. They drew attention. He utilized a combat technique developed by the Boeing-Lockheed Elite Defense Forces during the Mars insurrection. Absolute, silent pacification. He clamped his left arm over the pirate's mouth, simultaneously driving his scavenged combat knife directly into the juncture between the alien's cervical vertebrae. The massive creature spasmed and died without a sound, Arthur lowering the heavy body gently to the deck to prevent the thud of impact. He moved to the next target, a quick, brutal snap of the knee joint, followed by a crushing strike to the larynx. The pirate collapsed, suffocating silently in the dark. By the time the remaining 4 Skarn realized their squad was vanishing, Arthur was already in the rafters above them. He unclipped one of the scavenged thermal detonators, primed it, and dropped it perfectly into the center of their formation. "Contact!" one of the pirates roared, his optic sensor finally catching the falling explosive. It was too late. The detonator vaporized the entire squad in a blinding flash of white-hot plasma, the shockwave rattling the structural integrity of the corridor. Arthur didn't pause to admire his work. He was already moving toward the cargo bay. The tactical situation was heavily in his favor, and he was determined to press the advantage. On the bridge, Crix and Xanthos watched the thermal scans in awe. Tactical Assessment Log. Skarn Boarding Party. Initial hostile count. 48. Current hostile count. 12. Time elapsed. 14 minutes, 30 seconds. Human operator status. Uninjured, optimal. "It is impossible," Crix whispered, her bioluminescence flashing a rapid, bewildered yellow. "He is dismantling a heavily armored strike force. He has no armor. He has no natural weapons. Yet, they are falling like brittle leaves in a solar storm. How can a species be this lethal?" Xanthos shook his head slowly. "Because, Crix, we did not find a pet adrift in that escape pod. We found a weapon, and whoever put him in that pod was trying to keep him away from civilized space." The sheer audacity of the situation left the bridge crew of the luxury cruiser paralyzed in their immaculate, climate-controlled sanctuary. High Captain Xanthos and First Officer Crix watched the internal security feeds in absolute, unblinking horror. The creature they had treated like a delicate, dim-witted lapdog for 6 standard months was currently stalking the blood-soaked corridors of their highly advanced vessel. He was systematically dismantling a heavily militarized Skarn boarding party with the ruthless, mechanical efficiency of a sentient weapon system. The contrast was too much for the Veltra to process. This was the same being that had pretended to struggle with holographic door handles just hours ago. Now, he was a ghost of violence. Crix leaned over her primary tactical console, her bioluminescence flashing a rapid, sickly pale yellow. His kinetic output is breaking every known law of biological mass. Look at the telemetry, Captain. He possesses no exoskeleton, no hydraulic enhancements, yet he just shattered a scarred spine with a localized blunt force strike. The density of his skeletal structure must be astronomical. Xenthos could only nod numbly, his mandibles clicking in a rhythmic expression of profound shock. Malachor, the towering Skarn warlord, who had terrorized the Kalan Drift for a standard decade, did not stay to fight. For the first time in his long, brutal career of piracy across the Outer Rim, he experienced the cold, paralyzing grip of existential terror. He fired wildly, superheated plasma scorching the pristine chronal glass bulkheads and melting the expensive Veltra tapestries, and then he turned and fled. His heavy, cybernetically enhanced footfalls pounded against the deck plating as he desperately rushed back toward the primary cargo bay where the boarding pods were docked. The warlord's mind raced, his heavy respiratory organs heaving. The Skarn were apex predators bred for orbital boarding actions and heavy infantry assault. They had crushed heavily armed corporate security forces and planetary militias with ease. But this was not combat. This was an extermination. The tiny, hailless creature moved faster than Malachor's primary optic senses could track. The warlord barked frantic orders into his tactical comms link, ordering his remaining squads to fall back, to consolidate their forces, but all he heard in return was the static of dead channels and the sudden, terrifying silence of his men being wiped from existence. Arthur Campbell did not immediately give chase. He knelt beside the fallen pirates in the ruined vault, his movements deliberate, unhurried, and devoid of any emotional spike. He scavenged 2 heavy thermal detonators from a dead pirate's utility belt, a high-capacity plasma pistol, and a heavy tactical relay. He tapped his neck, finding the microscopic scar behind his left ear. With a sharp press, he synced the captured alien technology with his subdermal Academi Stellari combat interface. It was a highly illegal, heavily classified piece of hardware manufactured by a shadow subsidiary of Palantir Technologies back on Earth, designed for deep cover operatives working beyond the fringes of United Earth government space. The hardware booted up instantly. Arthur's vision was immediately overlaid with a crisp, pale green tactical display. The Palantir software went to work, rapidly deciphering the alien ship's localized architectural schematics, calculating thermal blooms through the bulkheads, and mapping the precise trajectory of every hostile presence on board. The visual feed gave him real-time atmospheric data, gravity differentials, and even the structural integrity of the decking beneath his feet. Arthur breathed in the scent of ozone and copper. He was back in his element. The luxurious, mind-numbing vacation was officially over. He tapped his internal comms link, broadcasting a heavily encrypted signal directly into the bridge's main audio receiver. "Captain Xenthos, do you read me?" The voice that echoed across the bridge lacked any of the submissive, high-pitched whining Arthur had used for the last 6 months. It was a steady, cold, baritone growl of a veteran operator. In the bridge, Xenthos jumped, staring at the console. "Arthur, what exactly are you?" The captain's voice trembled with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. "I am the man who is going to keep you and your crew alive. Today, Captain," Arthur replied, his tone remaining perfectly flat. "But you need to follow my tactical orders exactly. I need you to override the lockdown protocols on decks 4 through 7. Drop the environmental lighting to 5% and entirely disengage the atmospheric scrubbers in the lower cargo bay." Xenthos hesitated for a fraction of a second, his aristocratic pride wrestling with his survival instinct. "Do it, Crix!" Xenthos shouted. "Execute the command immediately." The ship plunged into near-total darkness. The emergency crimson strobes ceased entirely, leaving only the faint, eerie glow of floor-level emergency strips. 4. The Skarn, whose heavy optic sensors were strictly calibrated for the bright, harsh lighting of deep space combat and planetary invasions, the sudden darkness was utterly blinding. They roared in confusion, their targeting lasers cutting uselessly through the pitch-black corridors. For Arthur, whose species had evolved hunting in the pitch-black canopies and treacherous plains of primordial Earth, it was a familiar friend. Furthermore, his Palantir display highlighted the massive, heat-radiating bodies of the panicked pirates in bright, blooming thermal silhouettes that painted the walls. He bypassed the main corridors entirely, slipping into the ship's expansive ventilation shafts. The gravity difference remained his greatest weapon. The alien xenobiologists had completely failed to account for the fundamental physics of Earth's dense gravity well. Unburdened by the low-gravity environment of the Veltra ship, his velocity increased exponentially. He did not just walk. He propelled himself with a terrifying, silent grace, utilizing stealth infiltration protocols originally developed by Raytheon's Black Ops division. In Sector 4, a squad of 6 heavily armed Skarn marauders was attempting to manually breach the secondary engineering bay, desperately hoping to disable the ship's remaining deflector shields and regain control of the engagement. They were shouting guttural commands, deeply confused by the sudden darkness and the absolute loss of contact with their fleeing warlord. Arthur dropped from the ceiling access panel directly behind their rearguard. He did not use a scavenged firearm. Firearms made noise. They drew unwanted attention. He utilized a combat technique developed by Boeing's elite defense forces during the brutal Mars insurrection, absolute silent pacification. He clamped his left arm over the massive pirate's mouth, simultaneously driving his stolen combat knife directly into the juncture between the alien's thick cervical vertebrae. The heavy creature spasmed and died there completely silently. He dropped the lifeless giant down. The hunt continued now. If you loved this terrifying deep space showdown and want more adrenaline-pumping, HFY sci-fi stories where humanity proves they are the undisputed apex predators of the galaxy, make sure to hit that like button. Share this story with your friends to spread the word of Earth's ultimate warriors. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for weekly uploads of the best science fiction drama on the internet. Stay safe out there in the cosmos.
Hi, my name is Tran Trong, the owner and manager of Palace Truths. After watching the video, they thought the human was a weak pet, until the pirate Armada breached the hull. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? For me, the strongest feeling was surprise mixed with respect. I liked how the story showed that appearances can be incredibly misleading. Arthur seemed harmless at first, but when everyone else lost hope, his experience and calm thinking completely changed the situation. That contrast made the story especially satisfying. I'm curious what stood out to you the most. Was it the moment Arthur stopped pretending to be harmless, the first encounter with the pirate boarding party, or the way the aliens slowly realized who they had rescued? And if you had been aboard that ship, do you think you would have recognized his true potential before everything unfolded? One lesson I took from this story is that we shouldn't judge people only by what we see on the surface. In everyday life, taking the time to understand someone's character or experience can change the way we see them. If this story kept you engaged or gave you something interesting to think about, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy HFY stories about hidden strength, courage, and human resilience, feel free to like the video or subscribe if you'd like to see more.